Hello and welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to learn about Azure business to business, that's called B2B, and also business to consumer, or we call it as B2C. So these identities how to manage, because this is also a part of your Azure Active Directory, because some way or other way within your Azure real world you might have to depend on one of these identities. Or how do you manage, let's say for a B2B case or B2C case. So I'm going to talk on what is B2B, that's business to business, as well as the business to consumer. So this lecture I'm going to explain as a high level of overview so that you will understand what is these two technical terms and how they are benefit. So I'm going to draw here a lot and I'll try my best to explain. I'm sorry for my handwriting, which I'm trying to draw over the mouse. So the first thing is, let's go back to the traditional Active Directory where you have your on-premises. Let's say you have here your on-premises Active Directory where your traditional identities used to be managed from here. Let's say a user or computer resources they are, and if they wanted to collaborate with any other users, you might have to use your ADFS features, and you used to work with other partners. Now when it comes to the cloud, so you have here Azure AD, so AAD here, and the users, if you want your on-premises Active Directory users to be synced with your Azure Active Directory, you will definitely use AAD Connect. By this time you know that. If you have not gone through the lecture about AAD Connect, please go through it. So your all identities will be synced into one identity. It becomes where a single management for you to manage them, the user accounts which are coming from the on-premises. This is all about the so far we have learned. Now let's take a business case where you have some of the user identities. Let's say here it can be maybe a I can say that it can be from a Gmail, or maybe a user coming, let's say as Gmail, a user, or maybe a different user, maybe from, for this matter, let's take AAD user, or maybe some other specific identity managed solution user. But what we're trying to do is you have hired maybe, or um, you have a business case where they have to work on your Azure resources within your Azure cloud. So in that situation, what you do is you have to collaborate with these identities, or that means you are inviting a user who is in other identity. Let's say Gmail user, or maybe another Azure AD user, or maybe some identity, let's say Hotmail, or maybe he has its own identity management, let's say Active Directory user also. It doesn't matter. At the end, what we are trying to do is we will invite them to join in our business to business integration. So what would happen? So you would actually able to grant these users. Let's say if I have a user here, maybe a Pavan example, so this Pavan user can manage. So when you invite, you can grant access with the RBAC. So role based access management can be applied, and you can assign even the licenses for that user. Let's say the user, when the user onboarded, so this Pavan user is logs in with this Pavan at the Gmail example. So this identity, when you invite the user, when he sign up, so you can assign for that identity a P2 license, maybe Azure AD P2 license or P1 license, or maybe you can grant the access for a specific virtual machines or some applications, some resources, or you can manage very similar way that you used to manage the identities that are on your Azure Active Directory. Let's say you have a user account within your Azure AD. The way you manage them, similar methods you can manage the users in the B2B case. So here you need to understand how this is happening is, so when you invite a user from the Gmail, what would happen is, for the first time, if the user try to uh, get an email. So normally when you invite, he will be receiving an email saying that, hey, you are invited for collaborating to business case, so you please come and join to this Azure AAD tenant. So it says that, hey, okay, I can join, but before you join you have to create a Microsoft ID. So that's a very important part here. So if you don't have a Microsoft ID with this email ID, which is in this case pawan@gmail.com, so what would happen is it will ask you to create a identity which is in a Microsoft. So with that help, actually it is managing. So at the end, you're using Microsoft ID for the management. So that's in the backend. For you, it's just the email ID. Uh, that's where you're actually managing. So let's jump into the quick look at how B2B can be drawn. So let's keep this drawing for some time. So now I have actually logged into the Azure portal. So what I can do is, if I just go to Microsoft Azure Active Directory, all I have to do is just go to the Azure AD, and from the users, instead of you create a new account, you can actually invite as a guest user. So when you try to invite any user, this is going to be a collaboration purpose you can use. If you see here, so I'm going to invite a user to a different account. So this is some other domain altogether. So I'm just giving the name and the email ID, first name, last name, and please join with the personal email content. And I can use the location. This is as needed. So I'll just give here as the India or some other location, and you can give here as the contractor or whatever the job title. So invite. So what would happen is it's going to invite the specific user. So once it sends the invitation, if you see here, the icon also changed for the specific user as the global specific one, and he's from the guest account. And I should be able to check for the specific user account the email ID. So if I check the email ID, I would be getting an email with this specific email saying to join. So this is a link. If I browse for you, so this is a temporary email ID. So you see here, please only act on this email if you trust the organization, respond them. And this is the domain name, paddymatylab.onmicrosoft.com, and with this organization name. So simply my text also coming up. So all I have to do is I have to click. If you accept this invitation, you will be sent to so and so. So accept the invitation. So this is going to be take it to to create a Microsoft account, because that specific account does not have any Microsoft account. So if you see here, set up your account with Microsoft, that's what it's trying to do. So all I have to do is I have to give a password and a display name, or for example, this is Pawan from B2B. So I'll just give as a B2B just to identify for this demo, and the password. I'll give here the password and click on next. So I got a verification code which is sent to again my email. So all I have to do is again one more time I have to check my email. So here if we just go back to the emails, so I should be able to, I can see here another verification code sent to this ID, and this is the verification code number. I simply enter this code, so and verify. Now a specific account will be created with a Microsoft account, and with that Microsoft is trying to manage, and it is allowing us to manage the entire identities. So this is all about the B2B. So with this, what you can do is you can grant access for the users the way you want it. Let's say if you want to grant for a specific resource group level permission, you can do that. You can grant if an Azure admin permissions, also global admin permissions, also you can grant it. So all these permissions, all this can be completely set up for with the help of the B2B. And if you see, this resource is not shared by Microsoft, and all this consent is coming up, so I can give here this consent. Now the user is able to log on. So that's how B2B works. So if you granted any of the application, he can collaborate within the applications, or maybe an Azure portal also. You can assign the licenses for this specific user by going to the user properties, and simply assign the required licenses, and also the applications can be granted. Even you can grant the roles. Let's say you want to assign a specific role, let's say for the Azure admin role or application developer role or B2B specific or billing admin, all these roles. So it's very similar to the your on premises or maybe your Azure AD specific account. So because the identities got created as a Microsoft account, and you can fully trust that, and you can grant the required permissions based on the exact requirements. So that's how it's going to work for the B2B. And let's jump into B2C. Now, when it comes to the Azure B2C, that's a business to consumer. I'm talking about the consumer. Consumers are your product buyers or maybe product using persons. That means you will have some application. Let's say you have an application here, and this application needs, maybe it could be a web application or maybe a mobile application. So what would happen is, within this application, the users will try to log in with their social identity. So let's say, when I say social, it can be your FB, that's a Facebook identity, or Google identity, or Microsoft identity, or maybe GitHub, or maybe some other social identity. So that with that user sign up process, or with that identity, they can use these applications. For this, what Microsoft has come up is they they have actually created a separate tenant. So we know that within our Azure AD tenant, we had our own internal tenant, right? So within this tenant, you have the user IDs, and even on-premises Active Directory accounts also got synced, and it was showing within your Azure AD Connect. With the help, it is able to show in Azure Active Directory. And also, when you actually offer for the B2B, you are actually invited the users, and that account's also able to view within Azure Active Directory tenant. But now when it comes to the B2B, now with the B2C, you can actually grant the access for your consumers over the Facebook, or maybe Facebook authentication, or Google authentication, or maybe GitHub or Microsoft authentication, or some other social profile authentication like Twitter or whatever, the social profiles. So it's not just the social profiles. If the user does not want to log in with the social profile, he can choose even local authentication. So what happens is, within the B2C, you have the two options. One is a local, other one is the social. So with the social, they can go for all the social profiles, and other one would be the local. So within the local, they can use either email method or some other method to use that as their identity, and they can log in. Let's say you're trying to log into a website, so that website is offered as the B2C, right, within your Azure Active Directory. So you're managing as a separate. So this is where the developers and other teams who closely work on B2C tenant. So that's how the B2C works. So let's uh, have a look on the in action. So in order to work with the B2C, you have to create B2C as a tenant. So you shouldn't be going for a existing tenant, right? So you can't use the existing tenant. That's what B2C, right? So you need to have a new B2C tenant. So if you search as a B2C, you might get it, but most of the time, if you have not yet created, if you're the first time going to B2C, you get like this, and it says that, hey, you have to create it. So you would get into stuck phase altogether. So you have to go to this main hub, and from here create a resource, and click on that and go to identity. And if you scroll down here, Azure Active Directory B2C, so you get an option that as a first step, you need to create a B2C tenant, and then you can actually link this B2C tenant to a subscription so that the billing would happen, right? So I'm just clicking on to create a B2C tenant. So I can give here my organization name. So if you see here, I actually logged in with this ID, and I have a different tenants. That means different even directories. So one more directory it's going to create here, that's for B2C. So I'll just give here best name is B2C demo, and initial domain name B2C demo 501, or maybe just give as the AZ exam. And if this is available to tenant, it will be coming as a green checkbox, and then you can choose the tenant where it should actually locate. So I'm just choosing as a default as the United States, and I'm going back to the review and create. So I'm gonna create this. So it takes some time to create. Post to the creation, I have to switch from here to a different directory because we just created a tenant with the B2C. So I have to switch back here to a different tenant, or if I click on that specific resource which was just created, it will switch back to that tenant. Post to that, I can work with that identities. Now the tenant has been created, and if you see here, I can click on here to switch back to that tenant, or from here I can switch that to that specific tenant. So if I just click on here, it's going to open a new tab. So once the web page is open, it clearly says that hey, you don't have any linking between B2C tenant or to your subscription, so you need to do that. That's the attention, so that we can do that. So you have the three-step process. The first one is you can register your application, and you can add your identity providers, which is your social profiles or your local, and then you can create a user flow, how the user flow should be. So now this is the tenant has been created, a complete new tenant. So if I go here within this tenant, I do not have any other identities which I have created earlier. Let's say I have created maybe earlier with some test account, so that account is no more exist, or you do not have your employees identities here because this is purely dedicated a tenant for your consumers. So all you have to do is you can create from here new user account if you want B2C specific user, or you can invite the users similar way so that they can collaborate within this specific tenant. And it's time for us to do the full demo on B2C. So as we discussed, we have the three steps. The first one is registering your application. So that means that your developer has really developing an application that is has to be registered here within the B2C tenant. And later point you will be giving the identity providers so that who can actually use the authentication, for example email ID, which we talked as a local, as well as the social profiles. And the third step would be creating a flow where we talk about do we need to have their pin code or phone number or email ID, such a creation flow we can talk about it. So total three steps which involves in the B2C. So these steps actually mostly works by your developers, not your Azure admins, but still you need to know what happens here, right? So what we do is we just go to the first step as a registering an application. We go to a register application. So this is where you can think that you are actually a developer and try to create it. So what we do is we simply go back here and register a new registration. This is where I can give here my application name. Let's say this application is for web app 1 example, and I can say that this is only for accounts that are in B2C domain only, or the accounts are within my AD multi-tenant, or accounts in organization directory, or any identity providers uh, that are for authenticating users within B2C. So I can choose here B2C example, or you can actually go for this article to find out which one is suitable for you. So this information knows to the developers by default because they are having a scope where they wanted to develop this application, or open for authentication, to open for B2C only tenant, or a single tenant, or multi-tenant with AD collaboration, or open for all the identity providers, in this case maybe Google, Twitter, or OpenID Connect, or Microsoft, Facebook, all the social profiles also. So I'm just choosing this any identity provider, and then this is where I have to give the web application URI, and I'm just giving here, this is one of the Microsoft IT, and here you can choose this is going to be a web or a mobile or desktop or single page application. So I'm just choosing here as a web, and the permissions, coming back to the permissions, so you can give the consented for OpenID offline access permissions if you want, so you can grant them and register. So now we register the application, which will be available for almost any tenant identity. So this is the application name. So this is the application. Now what I can do is, once the application got created, I can go back to API specific permissions or maybe authentication here. I can grant implicitly specific permissions like access tokens or token IDs, so that they can actually use these access within your ASP.NET or core application. So these information knows to your developers, and they can simply uh, uh, take whatever the access tokens they need. And post to that, even I can go for the secrets where you have yours as your key vault, and there you can store your certificates and keys information. And you can call these application also, so that you're not actually storing any of the permissions within your code, the user ID or password information. Instead, it is actually storing within your Azure Key Vault services. So that's what the most secured way of calling your application with the user ID and password from Azure Key Vault services. And you can use that feature also. Let's go back to user flow now. So what I have to do is, as a next step, I have to go for user flows. So this is all about the policies. When we talk about the user flows, like sign up process, you can define here, let's say sign up or sign in process or profile editing, password reset, how you're actually configuring as a policy for your consumers. So I can see here the unique string that can be used within your user flow to request. So this can't be changed later point as it says. So you can give here a specific name. For example, I can give here, this is specific to sign up, so I'll just give sign up uh, process, and now I can allow the at least one of the identity should be provided, like email ID, and use the multi-factor authentication if really needed. Let's say users have to be challenged with more than one factor of authentication, then we can enable the multi-factor authentication. You can take that advantage. And coming back to the user attributes claims, you can say that you need to have maybe a given name or surname or city or email ID. So these things can be given, or even more information. If you just go through here, you have the street ID, state, postal code, all that attributes also can be chosen. Once you have chosen that, you can create. So this got created now a profile for the user. So when they try to sign up, this specific profile configuration would be asked for them. So now we have created an application, we have registered that application, and now we also have the user profiles. Now you can also configure your company branding, which is similar to what we have done with the Azure Active Directory. Branding, customization, same options, similar things, but this is more about your B2C specific. So all the settings remain same. You can choose that. And also we talked about the user attributes, uh, which are built in. These are the things, if you want, you can add furthermore so that you can call them when you are actually calling. So coming back to the identity providers, this is where you can um, go and register a specific authentication providers. Let's say if I want from the Google, I can go ahead into the Google and then sign up with the Google as the provided document. So what happens is they would actually give you a authentication specific information, and they give you a specific code. You can enter that code so that the users can be authorized with the Google. So let's try to identify how to do that. So you can simply go to the sign up. If you don't have an account, once you have the account, simply go to Google Developers Console, and you can log in with your account details. Once you sign up within the Google account, it's gonna ask you to create. I mean, basically, you get this specific console, which is mostly used with the developers, and most of the developers knows this how to configure. But just to show you here, what I can do is I can go to APIs and services and go to OAuth consent screen. Simply click on this so that you get as external or internal. So I can choose the Google account here. Uh, in this case, it should be external and then create. So it's going to create a consent screen. Here I need to give here the application name. Let's say I wanted to give as a web app 1, and I can choose here my application specific logo also. And here it's going to actually choose for the email ID, profile, open ID specific, and if I want, I can add further level of scoping information here. And post to that, I can grant here the domain name. Say, let's say if my domain name is b2clogin.com example, so I can simply give that, and the application homepage, whatever the application homepage is there, that I can give here. So once I have given this, I can actually save this and go to credentials. Within these credentials, you have to click on create credentials and then go back to OAuth client ID and choose your application type, in this case web application, and give a name of your application name. And here you need to give the two URIs. So the first one is the domain name. So I have a domain name as my complete B2C tenant ID. I can simply add, and then I can give the authorization URI. So what happens is with the authorization URI, with your domain name, that's a tenant ID, with OAuth 2 and uh, auth recipe, and simply click on that. That would actually gives here an option, and then click on create button. So this is going to create a credential, secret credentials for you, and that credential, which is this client ID and your secret ID, this information you can actually give it here. So you see here, you can give the provider is, in this case, Google, and client ID and the secret name. So I just have to go here and get that specific key information. So I'll just copy this one, client ID, copying, and going back to my this page, and then I'll also copy my your client secret. So whoever have the secret and this information, they can actually allow the end users to log in or authenticate to my application. So simply save that. So this information gets saved. So this is how you configure for only Google. Now what happens is, if you wanna go for Facebook, let's say you want to configure for Facebook, what you can do is you can do that similar steps. Again, you need to provide the client ID, client secret. So every company, every identity provider will have a different steps. So how do you know is simply go to the documentation here and click on that and go through this entire documentation. And you need to know, most of the time what would happen is, if you are trying to authenticate any of these authentication providers or identity providers, so you need to have their account. Let's say Amazon, you need to have the Amazon account. Let's say if you are trying to authenticate with the LinkedIn, so you need to have a LinkedIn account. Once you have, you maybe go back to developer mode of that authentication or identity provider. That's where actually it's gonna ask you to, if you see here, it's going to be developer. In this, you need to create a application type and then give your application URLs so that it knows that, oh, I'm actually trying to authenticate with this specific URL, and this specific URL is already have a client ID and a client secret. So it will just validate that client ID and secret, and it gets logged in automatically. And that's how you're going to actually load. So this is how B2C. So the major difference between B2C and B2B, if we look at here, B2C is nowhere actually taking any of the accounts from your Azure Active Directory. So it's actually inviting users from different profiles or different identity providers, or you can also create your local identities. And whereas the B2B is mostly about, or it's actually about your Azure Active Directory, because when you invite any other identity provider, they are going to create their own Microsoft ID, and for that Microsoft ID, whatever the permissions we grant it, they can manage the Azure resources also. But whereas with the B2C, the users are coming to the B2C, they cannot manage any of the Azure resources. Instead, their scope is completely limited to that specific application. So the application only can be allowed. Let's say you have an hospital enrollment, maybe. So that's the application. So consumer will go and log into hospital web portal, and he will give their social ID profile to authenticate, or he will create his own email ID based authentication, and he will access that application. So his scope is completely limited. That's why complete isolation came into the picture to create have their own identity based on their own tenant. Hope this entire lesson is useful for you to better understand about B2C and B2B and Azure Active Directory. Thank you for watching this.